Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 6 says, "But without faith it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him." Seeking God is central to living a life that's pleasing to God. And we have just considered in Lesson 3 some elements that are essential to the life that desires to seek God. But now I want us to consider the lives of some individuals recorded in the pages of Scripture to see how they sought God. Listen to Hebrews chapter 12 and in verse 1 as we begin this study. "Therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us." This statement comes immediately after the Hebrew writer has just commended the wonderful examples of faith to us, people like Abel and Enoch and Noah, Abraham, Moses, Gideon, etc. And now he demonstrates that these individuals are actually helpful to us in living lives that seek God. He says that they constitute a great cloud of witnesses and indicates that they ought to encourage us as we run our own race of faith to please God. With this language involving a race, the concept of these individuals being a great cloud of witnesses may well compare these men and women of faith as spectators in an arena. So as we run our race of faith trying to please God and seek him diligently, as Hebrews 11 and verse 6 states, we can look around the arena and see Noah, Abraham, Moses, and the other great Bible examples of men and women who sought God during their lives, cheering us on to victory. Surely these examples ought to encourage us and help us to lay aside everything that would try to hinder us from seeking God in our lives and press toward the finish line in our own race. Therefore, let's spend our time in this lesson considering 7 examples of many that could be discussed that will help us to live in a way that seeks to please God. While the majority of these examples did not live under the same law of God that we live under today, we can still learn from their commitment to seek God and the general principles they had in their lives. First, let's think about Noah. Noah sought God in his life. And as we read the biblical record of this man's life, he is among those cheering us toward victory in our race to seek God. Therefore, let's take a few moments to learn some valuable lessons from Noah. First, we see that he lived a life that was different from the world. After Adam and Eve were cast out of the Garden of Eden because of their sin, we read about mankind increasing in population on the earth. And we also read about how man's increasing population also corresponded with sin increasing on the earth. We read about Cain and his wickedness toward his brother Abel. We read about the wickedness of some of Cain's descendants. And then, by the time we come to Genesis 6, God saw that the wickedness of man on the earth had reached a point that every intent of the thought of man's heart was only evil continually, according to verse 5. In fact, the Lord was sorrowful that he had even made man on the earth, verse 6. Therefore, with this wickedness being so prevalent on the face of the earth, God determined that he would destroy man, verse 7. And as the record in Genesis 6 continues to explain, God would do this by sending rain upon the earth to cover the entire world. However, as God searched throughout the entire world for someone who would seek after him and was only finding one wicked person after another, God saw that Noah was different. Genesis 6 and verse 8 says, "But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord." In verse 9, it describes Noah as a just man, perfect in his generation, and says that Noah walked with God. Consequently, God would save him and his family from the destruction of the flood by means of an ark, and we'll see more on that here in just a moment. Now, I do not know what kind of wickedness was prevalent on the earth during this time. I have little doubt that it was the same kind of wickedness that the Bible repeatedly identifies, and that's prevalent in our world today. But regardless of the specifics, recognize that even though no one else beside Noah's family sought God in the world, Noah still lived to please God. In fact, 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 5 describes Noah as having been a preacher of righteousness. This indicates that Noah not only lived a righteous life in a world of wickedness, but he also tried to convince others around him to live righteous lives that sought God. Next, we learn from Noah that he obeyed the instructions God gave him. Because Noah sought God during the course of his life, he was going to be spared from the destruction of the flood by means of an ark God instructed him to prepare. In doing so, Noah and his family would be saved from the wickedness of the world, as you can see in 1 Peter 3 and verse 20. Listen to the testimony of Noah given in Hebrews chapter 11 and in verse 7. It says, "By faith Noah, being divinely warned of things not yet seen, moved with godly fear, prepared an ark for the saving of his household, by which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is according to faith." Noah believed God. Noah believed that God was going to bring a great flood upon all the earth. And Noah believed that if he prepared an ark according to God's instructions, God would save him and his family. But Noah did not just mentally accept these things to be true. Instead, being warned of these things he had not seen, he moved with godly fear and prepared an ark for the saving of his household. His full confidence in God and in what God had said led him to take the appropriate actions. So whenever God promised to save Noah and his family by the ark, Noah built the ark according to God's specifications. These specifications included that the ark was to be built out of gopher wood, that rooms were to be made inside the ark, that the ark was to be covered inside and outside with pitch, that the length of the ark was to be 300 cubits, which was about 450 feet, that the width was to be 50 cubits, or about 75 feet, and that the height was to be 30 cubits, or about 45 feet. There was to be one window and one door, and then there was to be 3 decks or levels, as you can see in Genesis chapter 6, verses 14 through 16. In addition, God gave Noah instructions about the animals that were to be brought on board the ark, as you can see in Genesis 6, verses 19 through 21. Given all these instructions, certainly Noah had a lot of work to do. However, because of his unwavering trust in God, he acted with godly fear to do exactly as God had commanded him. Genesis 6 and verse 22 says, "Thus Noah did. According to all that God commanded him, so he did." Notice that Noah did not change any of the instructions God had given him. He didn't change the type of wood the ark was to be made of. He didn't change the dimensions of the ark, etc. He simply did what God had instructed him to do. And as a result, Noah and his family were saved on board the ark. Next, as we think about examples of some who sought God, let's think about Abraham. Abraham sought God in his life. As we read the biblical record of this man's life, he is among those cheering us toward victory in our race to seek God. Therefore, let's take a few moments to learn some valuable lessons from Abraham. First, Abraham obeyed God in leaving his homeland. In Genesis 12, in the first 3 verses, the Lord said to Abraham, who was then named Abram, "Get out from your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Can you just imagine being told by God to leave your home and leave the place your family is in order to go to a place that is entirely new to you? That's what Abraham was told to do. And notice that the foundation of going to this land was because God promised to make Abraham a great nation, to give his descendants the land he was told to travel to, according to verse 7, and bless all families of the earth through Abraham's descendants. Now, verse 4 identifies the fact that Abraham went as the Lord had spoken to him. But in order to appreciate this great example of faith, we need to understand that Abraham at this time was 75 years old and had no children. Yet Abraham fully trusted in God, knowing that he existed and that he would reward those who diligently sought him. So Hebrews 11 and verse 8 says concerning Abraham, by faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance, and he went out, not knowing where he was going. Later, Abraham and Sarah continued to grow older and remain childless. God continued to assure them of these same promises, and God assured them that he would bless them with a child. In Genesis chapter 21, Isaac was born while Abraham was 100 years of age. And then in Genesis 22, God tested Abraham's faith. At this time, God commanded Abraham in Genesis 22 and verse 2, take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Surely this would not only be difficult commandment for Abraham to hear as a father who dearly loved his son, but this son was also supposed to have been the son through whom God would fulfill the promises he had made to Abraham. Yet verse 3 says that Abraham rose early in the morning and went to the place God had commanded him, taking his son Isaac with him. On the third day they arrived at the place God had specified, and Abraham took his only son on the mountain, telling the young men who had traveled with them in verse 5, stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you. Taking all of the necessary provisions to complete the sacrifice, Isaac questioned his father about the animal for the sacrifice, to which Abraham faithfully responded, my son, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering. When they came to the place for the sacrifice, Abraham built the altar and placed the wood in order and bound his son and laid him upon the wood and the altar. Then he stretched out his hand to take the knife and slay his son, when the angel of the Lord called to him and instructed him not to slay his son, saying, now I know you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Verse 12. Consider the testimony of Abraham's faith recorded in Hebrews 11, verses 17 through 19. The writer says that it was by faith that Abraham offered up Isaac, because he had received the promises from God and concluded that God was able to raise him up even from the dead. So Abraham acted with the fear of God in complete obedience to God, because he was fully convinced that God existed and that God would reward those who diligently sought him. A third example of some who sought God is Moses. Moses sought God in his life, and as we read the biblical record of this man's life, he's among those who are cheering us toward victory in our race to seek God. Therefore, let's take a few moments to learn some valuable lessons from Moses. First, he chose to associate himself with the people of God. Moses' story begins with the faithful example of his parents. During this time that the Israelites lived as slaves in the land of Egypt, the Pharaoh commanded that every son born to the people of Israel was to be cast into the river and killed. And it was at this time Moses was born, as you can read in Exodus chapters 1 and 2. However, Moses' parents refused to comply with the wicked decree of the king and hid him for 3 months in the ark made of bulrushes placed along the riverbank. Hebrews 11 verse 23 says that Moses' parents did this by faith, not fearing the king's command. At this time, Pharaoh's daughter came to bathe in the river, discovered baby Moses, wept, and had compassion on him, even though she recognized that this was a child of the Israelites. And after being nursed for a time by his own mother, Moses was adopted by Pharaoh's daughter. Therefore, Moses was the adopted grandson of the king of Egypt. And as such, Moses would have had access to the best that the land of Egypt could have offered, and could have chosen to live a life of sinful pleasure. However, during a time when Moses went to his Hebrew brethren, the Israelites, he saw an Egyptian beating one of the Hebrews, so he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And later God called him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, as you can see in Exodus 2 and 3. Moses was faced with a choice. He could continue to live in Egypt and enjoy all the temporary pleasures associated with such, or he could live according to the calling of God and lead the people of Israel. Hebrews 11, verses 24 through 26 explains Moses' choice and his reasoning. It says, "By faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward." Moses was absolutely convinced that God existed despite all of the gods the Egyptians recognized and served, and that God would reward those who sought him. Furthermore, this passage indicates that Moses viewed seeking God as being even more worthwhile than seeking the pleasures involved in sin, recognizing that they were only temporary. Next, we see that Moses obeyed God in leading the people out of Egypt. As God called to Moses from the burning bush, God told Moses that he wanted to use Moses to deliver the Israelites from the oppression they experienced in Egypt and lead them to the land that was promised to Abraham's descendants, the land of Canaan. Although Moses questioned who he was that could bring the children of Israel out of Egypt, Exodus 3, verse 11, God assured Moses that he would be with him, according to verse 12. And after this point, Moses was sent with 2 miraculous signs from God to Pharaoh in order to demonstrate that God had determined the Israelites should be delivered from Egyptian slavery. However, as Moses came before his grandfather by adoption, the king of Egypt, performing the signs God had given him to perform, Pharaoh refused to let the people of Israel go. And later, God brought a series of 10 plagues upon the land of Egypt through Moses because of Pharaoh's stubbornness. After the final plague was performed, which was the death of every firstborn child in Egypt among the houses that did not have the sign for the Passover, the Israelites left the land of Egypt. However, as they left, Pharaoh's heart was hardened and pursued them with his army. And then whenever the Israelites came upon the banks of the Red Sea, with Pharaoh's army closing in, God worked the miracle through Moses to part the sea, allowing the Israelites to go on dry ground and destroy the Egyptian army. Thus Hebrews chapter 11 speaks further about the faith of Moses in verses 27 through 29. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians attempting to do so were drowned. Surely such an act against a powerful army and king would result in great devastation without God. But Moses trusted in God, even in doing the impossible. He trusted that God existed and that God would reward those who diligently sought him. Next, another example of one who sought God is Joshua. Joshua sought God in his life, and as we read the biblical record of this man's life, he is among those cheering us toward victory in our race to seek God. Therefore, let's take a few moments to learn some valuable lessons from Joshua. First, Joshua trusted in God when others did not. God had promised to give the land of Canaan to the descendants of Abraham. And after the descendants of Abraham, or the Israelites, had escaped from Egyptian captivity, they were brought to the doorstep of their inheritance. God commanded Moses to send 12 spies into the land of Canaan in order to see what the land was like and what the people of the land were like. And among these 12 spies were Joshua and also Caleb. In Numbers 13, the spies were sent into the land of Canaan, and when they returned to their people, they all reported that the land was magnificent. The people of the land were strong, and the cities were large and well protected. However, the interpretation of those same facts differed among the 12. 10 of the spies told the Israelites, according to Numbers 13 and verse 31, "We are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we." However, Joshua and Caleb gave a different kind of report. Caleb said in verse 30, "Let us go up at once and take possession, for we are well able to overcome it." Later, in Numbers 14, verses 7 through 9, Joshua and Caleb urged the people not to rebel against the Lord, claiming that if the Lord delighted in them, he would bring them into the land and give it to them. So what was it that was different in Joshua and Caleb than was present in any of the other 10 spies? They all saw the same things, but their conclusions were not the same. The 10 spies saw the physical strength and feared the people. However, Joshua and Caleb saw the physical strength of the people and feared God. They recognized that the God they were seeking was far stronger than any other person or group of people. And they knew that if they sought after God, he would keep his promises and reward them. Next, Joshua obeyed God in leading Israel into the land of promise. Unfortunately, the people of Israel sided with the 10 faithless spies. Consequently, all the people 20 years old and above would die in the wilderness, never being brought into the land of Canaan, according to Numbers 14, verses 28 and 29. The only exceptions would be Joshua and Caleb, according to Numbers 14 and verse 30. These two would play key roles in the later generation of the Israelites coming in and taking possession of the land. Particularly, Joshua was chosen by God to be the leader who would succeed Moses in bringing the Israelites into the land of Canaan. As you read the book of Joshua, you learn more about the conquest of the land God had promised to Abraham's descendants, and you learn about the great faith and obedience of Joshua. For instance, the first city of the land across the Jordan River the Israelites came to possess was the city of Jericho. This was a well-fortified city, but the Israelites, by placing their trust in God, had the city delivered to them whenever they faithfully obeyed God's instructions to march around the city and blow the trumpets. Hebrews 11, verse 30, says, "By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they were encircled for 7 days." Although this is just one example, Joshua and the Israelites demonstrated their faith in God and in his promise to reward those who diligently sought him. And then prior to Joshua's death, Joshua continued to encourage the people of Israel to seek God. He challenged them to remember the things God had done for them and determined to serve the Lord. For instance, Joshua 24 and verse 15 records the following statement of Joshua to the people. "And if it seems evil to you to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Regardless of what others would choose, Joshua and his family would serve the Lord. Next, David sought God in his life. As we read the biblical record of this man's life, he is among those cheering us toward victory in our race to seek God. Therefore, let's take a few moments to learn some valuable lessons from David. First, he trusted in God. As Saul was rejected by God as king over the Israelites, God searched for another man to be king. Specifically, 1 Samuel chapter 13 and verse 14 says that the Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be commander over his people. As you continue to read the account given, you quickly discover that this man after God's heart was David, as you can also see in Acts 13 and verse 22. This heart was repeatedly demonstrated throughout David's life. And through David, you can see a man who was dedicated to following God's ways, though he was not perfect. You can see his trust and dependence upon God as demonstrated frequently in the Psalms. And then as you read the biblical record of David's life, the fact that he trusted in God is made very evident in the story of David and Goliath in 1 Samuel 17. Goliath was a great champion and giant among the Philistines. And whenever the Philistines were challenging the Israelites, they issued a challenge for Israel to select one of their men to go against Goliath. The victor would result in his nation being master over the other. But there was no one in Israel who would answer this challenge until David volunteered. David was assured that God would deliver Goliath into his hand, as you can see in verse 37. So full of faith in God, David went into battle against this well-armed giant with only a sling and 5 smooth stones, yet he emerged from the battle victorious. David fully trusted in God and knew that God rewards those who diligently seek him. And then David also sought forgiveness of his sin with Bathsheba. Unlike the examples we've been studying up to this point, I now want us to focus on a time in David's life when he did not seek God first in his life. But I want to do this so that we can focus on how he renewed himself to seek after God and how he found forgiveness. In 2 Samuel chapter 11, David was on the roof of his house and saw Bathsheba, who was described as a very beautiful woman, and she was bathing. After this, David inquired about the woman. However, when he discovered that she was a married woman, she was the wife of Uriah, he still had her brought to him and committed adultery with her. After this sin, David discovered that Bathsheba was pregnant with his child. And after some failed attempts to conceal his sin, David had Bathsheba's husband placed in a situation he would be killed. Clearly, this man had sinned against God. He sought his own personal desires above the desires of God at this time. However, David's subsequent repentance demonstrates a man who sought God. He did not allow his sin to continue pulling him into a life of more and more sinful activity. Instead, he turned his life around. And after realizing the sin he had committed against God, David confessed in 2 Samuel 12 and verse 13, "I have sinned against the Lord." And then you could read Psalm 51 and observe how David sought God by pleading for God's forgiveness. Next, Josiah sought God in his life. As we read the biblical record of this man's life, he is among those cheering us to victory in our race to seek God. Therefore, let's take a few moments to learn some valuable lessons from Josiah. First, he humbled himself before the Lord. Josiah was 8 years old whenever he became king over Judah and would reign for 31 years, according to 2 Kings 22 and verse 1. Many other kings before him had been wicked and refused to seek God, and as a result, those who had been God's people in Judah were not practicing what God commanded them. Instead, there were even many idols that had been erected throughout the land. However, Josiah is described in 2 Kings 22 and verse 2 by the following: "And he did what was right in the sight of the Lord, and walked in all the ways of his father David. He did not turn aside to the right hand or to the left." For instance, whenever Josiah was king, the book containing the law of God was found in the house of the Lord, according to 2 Kings 22, verses 3 through 20. This law was then read and brought before the king and read in his presence. After reading the words of the book, Josiah recognized that the people had not been keeping God's commandment and that there were consequences promised for their rebellion. However, Josiah's heart was tender, and he humbled himself before the Lord, and the Lord promised that these consequences would not happen while Josiah was king, as you can read about in 2 Kings 22, verses 18 through 20. But after learning the instructions of God, you see that Josiah began making sweeping restorations in Judah. He made numerous attempts to bring the nation that was not pleasing to God to a point that it did please him. In fact, 2 Kings 23 and verse 3 says, "Then the king stood by a pillar and made a covenant before the Lord, to follow the Lord and to keep his commandments and his testimonies and his statutes with all his heart and all his soul, to perform the words of this covenant that were written in this book." And all the people took a stand for the covenant. As the chapter continues, we watch as Josiah commanded all of the articles for idols to be brought out of God's temple and burned outside of Jerusalem. Idolatrous priests were removed and even killed. Idols were destroyed throughout the land, and he even restored the observance of the Passover in Judah. Consider how 2 Chronicles 34 and verse 33 describes the work of Josiah. "Thus Josiah removed all the abominations from all the country that belonged to the children of Israel, and made all who were present in Israel diligently serve the Lord their God. All his days they did not depart from following the Lord God of their fathers. Therefore Josiah trusted that God existed and took whatever steps were necessary in order to diligently seek this God who promised to reward them for so doing. Finally, Paul is an example of someone who sought God. As we read the biblical record of this man's life, he is among those cheering us toward victory in our race to seek God. Therefore, let's take a few moments to learn some valuable lessons from Paul. First, he turned to the Lord. Prior to becoming a Christian, Paul was called Saul, and he persecuted those who followed Jesus Christ. Still, his zeal for seeking God is seen at this time. In Acts 22 and verses 3 through 5, Paul spoke of his training under the Jewish leader Gamaliel. He was taught according to the strictness of the sect of the Pharisees, the strictest sect in the Jewish faith at that time. He said that he was even so zealous toward God that he persecuted the way, or Christianity, to the death, and bound Christians in prison. Indeed, Paul was absolutely convinced that he must do these things contrary to the name of Jesus Christ in order to seek God, according to Acts 26, verses 9 through 11. However, Paul later realized that his zeal for God and his attempts to serve God in good conscience, as Acts 23 verse 1 references, had not been pleasing to God. Whenever Jesus appeared to Paul, while Paul was traveling to Damascus with the intent of persecuting Christians there, he became convinced that Jesus Christ is truly the Son of God and the Messiah, as you can read about in Acts chapter 9. And then, according to the instructions given to him, he was baptized for the forgiveness of his sins, as you can see in Acts 9 verse 18. In Acts 22 and verse 16. Now, please appreciate the fact that Paul's conversion from persecutor of Christian to being a Christian was not without cost. This decision would certainly impact his standing in the Jewish community. And all the years of Paul's training and his excellence in the Pharisaic sect would be drastically impacted by his decision to serve Jesus Christ. Yet Paul determined that he had not been seeking God according to the way of truth, and determined that seeking God was more important than anything else in his life. And he committed his life fully to Christ. After Paul became a Christian by being baptized for the forgiveness of his sins, he lived a life of faithful obedience and service to God. Also, being made an apostle of Jesus Christ, God would use Paul to teach the gospel of Jesus Christ throughout a great portion of this world. However, this great work Paul accomplished would not be without its share of difficulties. In fact, Paul went from being the persecutor of Christians to being persecuted as a Christian. You could read 2 Corinthians 11, verses 22 through 33, to observe many of the things Paul endured in his life as a child of God. This included shipwreck, imprisonment, beatings, hunger, thirst, frequent dangers, a stoning, etc. However, despite all of these things he was experiencing as a Christian, he endured. He did so because he had confidence in the salvation God had promised to those who seek him diligently, as you can see in 2 Timothy 1, verse 12, and 2 Timothy 4, verses 6 through 8. Listen to Galatians 2 and in verse 20, as Paul states the commitment he had made to serving Jesus Christ as Lord in his life. He said, "I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me." Paul's life was not about seeking his own desires anymore. Instead, Paul's life was fully committed to seeking God. Well, as we run our races on this earth, we are encouraged to seek God as we press toward the finish line by these and many other examples. Their examples have been preserved for us that we might learn from and be encouraged by them. Therefore, through considering their examples, it's my hope that you have a greater appreciation of what it means to seek God, as we discussed in Lesson 3. But are you willing to commit yourself to seeking God in the same kind of way as these? Will you determine to seek God first in your life, regardless of how others around you choose to live? Or will you only partially choose to seek Him or seek him in a way he does not desire to be sought. Please recognize that God only promises to reward those who diligently seek him, as demonstrated in the examples we've studied during this lesson.